Life is often so busy, taking us here, there, seemingly everywhere. When you aren't able to make it to church, we hope you are fed and nourished by listening to the preaching of God's Word wherever you are at the moment. In the meantime, take care, and God bless.
Welcome back to our Wednesday evening worship series this Lent. We're talking about how we can share our faith. We're on Sunday mornings renewing our faith together, and on Wednesday nights sharing our faith. This week is our final week in this series. We've talked about how we can share our faith with the things that we say and with the things that we don't say, the things that we do and the things that we don't do. And tonight, as we look forward to next week as Holy Week, we're not quite yet to the story of Palm Sunday and Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, looking forward to Easter on this last and final Lenten worship evening. We're discussing when all else fails and when in doubt, be kind. I think kindness really is a bedrock of our ability to share our faith. We've all been around folks who share their faith without kindness. In fact, last week, Pastor Lilliard shared how we can share our faith, but don't start by being judgy, right? That's one way of sharing your faith without that kernel of kindness. Kindness really can be a bedrock of how we can work together, how we can share in our neighborhoods, in our households, being kind to your siblings or your family members or the people in your school. These are often lessons that we teach our children. Our kids grew up watching Daniel Tiger as much as I grew up watching Mr. Rogers. Many of those lifelong lessons that we learn in those programs teach us about kindness, about how to interact with people, how to take care of people who might not have as easy access to the table that we might, how to set a table that welcomes different sorts of people to share who they are, how to be kind with one another. But I also think there is this flip side to kindness, and I've bumped into it as a transplant into Minnesota. We all know the phrase Minnesota nice, right? It's this phrase that often gets used, most often in a way to share how great it is to live in this state. Hardy people that endure dark winters and cold winters. But when the sun comes out and people are out on the walking trails, that there is this niceness, this kindness, this ability to smile for one another, maybe open doors for strangers that isn't necessarily there in other cities. In our own city, there is this perhaps niceness. But I've also heard people talk about how that Minnesota nice isn't equally accessible to everyone. I've only had a really tiny taste of this. I'm a transplant into Minnesota, and sometimes it's rather hard to make deeper friendships because people already have their plate so full of friends. Friends from high school because they've lived in this state their whole lives. Friends from college then that they picked up along the way. Friends, even generational friends, cousins and aunts and uncles, that the schedules just get full and there isn't a lot of time for new friendships. So that Minnesota nice has a limit. I've also heard from activists how Minnesota nice can sometimes be code for the dominant culture, the dominant white culture in our own midst. I was gathered with a group of young adults earlier this week, and we were taking this important season of Lent to reflect on how we can give up our complicity or our even buy into a culture of whiteness that's all around us, that's even the air that we breathe. And we heard from an activist on a video who used the image of a moving walkway, right? You've seen these moving walkways in airports. Maybe it's been a long time since you've been in an airport, but you know what they are, right? These moving walkways that help you get to a place a little bit quicker. And the activist shared that, this culture is somewhat the air we breathe. It's the motion underneath the sidewalk. It keeps the status quo going just as it ought to. And so she said some people actually go along with that. They're just happy to walk along the moving sidewalk, even as it's moving this whole community along, even if it's not in the most healthy of directions. And then there are other people who just stay put on the moving sidewalk. They aren't actively engaged in moving a direction that would not be in the benefit of some in our community. And they just stay put. And then there are other people who actually turn around and face the opposite direction. But, the moving sidewalk is still moving, and I really can't moonwalk. But it's still moving us in a direction, even if we intend to go in the opposite direction. And then she shared that there are others who might actually walk against the flow of traffic, so to speak, or maybe even recruit other folks to kind of start to walk in an opposite direction. But yet this moving sidewalk just keeps going in a direction. So sometimes I fear that this code language of nice or Minnesota nice or even kindness actually advantages people who can operate in that specific culture versus people who have a different cultural understanding. I want to give you another example, and it comes from this book, Friedman's Fables, which has been a really helpful book in my own understanding of myself and my family system. Edwin Friedman is maybe one of the most influential writers and teachers and psychologists in the family systems theory of psychology. And he wrote this book a long time ago to help people understand on the ground level how some of these concepts work. But rather than just reading this story to you while you're sitting at home, I asked Tim Graff to play a little soundtrack for our story. So let me read for you The Friendly Forest by Edwin Friedman. Once upon a time, in the friendly forest, there lived a lamb who loved to graze and frolic about. One day, a tiger came to the forest and said to the animals, "I would like to live among you." They were delighted, for unlike some of the other forests, they had no tiger in their woods. The lamb, however, had some apprehensions, which, being a lamb, she sheepishly expressed to her friends. "But," said they, "do not worry. We will talk to the tiger and explain that one of the conditions for living in this forest is that you must also let the other animals live in the forest." So the lamb went on about her life as usual. But it was not long before the tiger began to growl and make threatening gestures and menacing motions. Each time, the frightened lamb went to her friends and said, "It is very uncomfortable for me in the forest." But her friends reassured her, "Do not worry. That's just the way tigers behave." Every day, as she went about her life, the lamb tried to remember this advice, hoping that the tiger would find someone else to growl at. And it is probably correct to say that the tiger did not really spend all or even most of its time stalking the lamb. Still, the lamb found it increasingly difficult to remove the tiger from her thoughts. Sometimes she would just catch it out of the corner of her eye, but that seemed enough to disconcert her for the day, even if the cat were asleep. Soon, the lamb found that she was actually looking for the tiger. Sometimes days or even weeks went by between its intrusive actions, yet somehow the tiger's existence became a part of the lamb's existence. When she tried to explain this to her friends, however, they pointed out that no harm had really befallen her, and that perhaps she was just being too sensitive. So the lamb again tried to put the tiger out of her mind. Why, she said to herself, should I let my relationship with just one member of the forest ruin my relationships with all the others? But every now and then, usually when she was least prepared, the tiger would give her another start. Finally, the lamb could not take it anymore. She decided that, much as she loved the forest and her friends, more than she had ever loved any other forest or friends, the cost was too great. So, she went to the other animals in the woods and said goodbye. Her friends would not hear of it. This is silly, they said. Nothing has happened. You're still in one piece. You must remember that a tiger is a tiger, they repeated. Surely, this is the nicest forest in the world. We really like you very much. We would be very sad if you left. Though, it must be admitted that several of the animals were wondering what the lamb might be doing to contribute to the tiger's aggressiveness. Then, said two of the animals in the friendly forest, surely this whole thing can be worked out. We're all reasonable here. Stay calm. There is probably just some misunderstanding that can easily be resolved if we all sit down together and communicate. The lamb, however, had several misgivings about such a meeting. First of all, if her friends had explained away the tiger's behavior by saying it was simply a tiger's nature to behave that way, why did they now think that as a result of communication, the tiger would be able to change that nature? Second, thought the lamb, such meetings, well-intentioned as they might be, usually try to resolve problems through compromise. Now, while the tiger might agree to growl less, and indeed might succeed in reducing some of its aggressive behavior, what would she, the lamb, be expected to give up in return? Be more accepting of the tiger's growling? There was something wrong, thought the lamb, with the notion that an agreement is equal if the invasive creature agrees to be less invasive and the invaded one agrees to tolerate some invasiveness. She tried to explain this to her friends, but being reasonable animals, they assured her that the important thing was to keep communicating. Perhaps the tiger didn't understand the ways of a lamb. Don't be so sheepish, they said. Speak up strongly when it does these things. Though one of the less subtle animals in the forest, more uncouth in expression and unconcerned about just who remained, was overheard to remark, I never heard of anything so ridiculous. If you want a lamb and a tiger to live in the same forest, you don't try to make them communicate. You cage the bloody tiger. An odd story, I know. As Friedman's fables tend to be, they help us to scratch our heads, to think carefully about these things. But I want to highlight one line from the lamb. There was something wrong, thought the lamb, with the notion that an agreement is equal if the invasive creature agrees to be less invasive and the invaded one agrees to tolerate some invasiveness. When we talk about being kind, I think it's important to talk about how are we being kind and for whom are we being kind. I want to end with a story from Jesus, with a saying from Jesus. It's maybe one of those sayings you've heard so many times that maybe it has even lost its meaning. Jesus said as he was teaching to a large crowd, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but truly I tell you, pray, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He goes on to say, if someone hits you on the right side, you must turn the other cheek. Now, this would be some really significant way of even going further than kindness. This is almost becoming a doormat for someone to hurt or harm us. But we might actually miss the point of Jesus in this teaching. In fact, in the ancient world, for someone to actually hit someone on the right side, they would have to use their left fist. If you try it at home, you can even see it. But what is assumed in this teaching of Jesus is that Jesus was pointing at people of power who would often use the back of their hand to hit someone on the right cheek, because it was not acceptable to use your left hand for anything in the ancient world. But to use the back of your hand was a gesture to humiliate someone who was beneath you. So this was often a gesture used by the Roman Empire to then denigrate the Jewish people who were being oppressed. So when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, it demands that then on the left cheek, the person who had been harmed would demand that same equality from the person who had done the harming. Jesus goes on a second time in the same place to say, if someone takes your cloak, you should give them your undergarment also. Now, again, Jesus, if someone steals my coat, I should just give them all of my clothing? That doesn't make any sense. Unless we understand the indebted culture of the ancient world, that people were so in debt that the only thing left that a creditor could take as collateral for a debt was their overcoat. But there was a required law that they could only take it at night and give it back during the day so that people could put that overcoat on and maintain some normal dignity of operation. So when Jesus says, if they're taking your coat, he's talking specifically to the ancient debt practice. And so in the ancient world, as these people would take off their garment and even their undergarment, there was so much shame associated with taking off and having any form of nakedness in the public world, that shame didn't go on the person who was naked, but the person who caused the nakedness. So you can imagine that in a court of law, as someone was taking an overcoat and giving an undergarment as well, that you're actually shaming the creditor, the person in power. This is the revolutionary kindness of Jesus. The kindness of Jesus that undermines the powers in our world. The kindness of Jesus that listens for the least of these. The kindness of Jesus that asks the question, for whom am I being kind? So my question for us tonight is, indeed, we are called to be kind, but not for the sake of the status quo. Not for the sake of our sense of decorum, but we are called to be kind as Christians for the sake of our neighbor, and more importantly, for the sake of our neighbor in need. So this week, how might we be kind with a purpose? How might we be kind as an act of civil disobedience? How might we be kind in the same revolutionary kindness that Jesus taught some 2,000 years ago? Welcome to Lent. I hope this has been a time to reflect, to repent, and indeed to commit to walking together. Thanks be to God.
We hope you found this week's message helpful as you think about how you will live out your faith each day. If you would like to support the ministries at St. Andrew Lutheran Church, you can do so by having your credit card information available and then texting a gift to 952-260-9007.